I won't bore you with a long-winded CV other than to say I've been covering rugby for 27 years in South Africa and reported and commentated on close to 300 Springbok tests and more than 1,000 first-class games in that time. But sitting here, I'm two much greater rugby minds than mine and far too far superior storytellers. So you won't be disappointed this afternoon. Dave Wessels, on your left, is Saru's director of rugby, and most importantly, Rassie Erasmus's boss. So, so if Rassie's fired, you know who to blame. He was also a coach in Super Rugby, Rebels, and the Force. He brings a unique perspective to South African rugby, having coached here and, of course, in Australia. And alongside him is Frans Malherbe's boss, John Dobson. He's obviously no introduction, director of rugby at the Stormers and also Stormers coach, and been UCT coach, Western Province coach. CV is as long as my arm. Welcome. Thanks for joining me. Thanks, you guys. So what is Lessons from the Box all about? Well, I guess it's different things to different people. There's no one correct answer to this. This is just my attempt and our attempt to give some perspective, as people on the outside, Dave's on the inside. As a member of the media, I have slightly more access to players and coaches and administrators, but I'm still some distance from the epicenter of the box, the inner sanctum, if you like. And that's where the real business happens. And I think guys like Dobbo and Dave will say, thank goodness that members of the media are not even nowhere near the inner sanctum of rugby in South Africa. So I've been around a long time. I spent my working life making connections and reporting on the game, both on and off the field. So my insights here today are hardly definitive, but I have some perspective to offer about Springbok rugby, having in a very small way been on the fringes of it. And obviously we're at this gathering today, and we're going to talk about the current iteration of the box. When I say the current iteration, we're talking about 2018 to now, since the Rassie Erasmus return and Jacques Nienaber with him, and all the coaches that went with that. They've changed the face of South African rugby. I think most of us will agree, not just through winning, but through what they've meant to this country. This is not a business TED talk. This is not going to be definitive answers to your business problems, and you're going to go away and take lessons from this and implement them in your mission statements and so on. This is just trying to understand what has made this team of two-time world champions who came from rock bottom and learn a little something from the lessons from Rassie Erasmus and Siya Kolisi's men. And when I say Rassie Erasmus, I just want to be clear that we're also referring to people like Jacques Nienaber. I might say Rassie, but it sort of includes a lot, his entire coaching staff and the people around him. So I suppose where we should start is the return of Rassie Erasmus to South African rugby. And, it's probably forgotten now. In 2018, when he came back in as director of rugby, but then he also took on the Springbok coaching role, he said then and there to the South African media and to the public that in 2018, they were going to suffer. They needed to build depth, they needed to build experience, and they needed to do it quickly. They had a World Cup about 20 months away at that stage. And to do that, you'd have to chop and change the team. You'd have to make a lot of interesting selections to fast track experience in those 12 tests I think he had in 2018. And he said we would lose as much as we had won, and he was spot on. At the end of the 2018 year, the Springboks lost exactly 50% of the tests they played. And, in isolation, a 50% winning year, as Dobbo and Dave will tell you, is not a great outcome. But in the context of what was happening that year, it was massively important. And I think, I've covered rugby. I've seen the Springboks lose 52-16 at Loftus. I've seen them lose 49-0 in Australia. It happens. Big defeats happen. And, sometimes the team gets back on and they dust themselves off and they do well the next week. But what had happened by the end of 2017, and I think this is where Saru was shocked, this is where most people in South African rugby were shocked. South African rugby fans had been through the full gambit of emotions: anger, despair, grief, acceptance. But they had got to the point of indifference. And I think when it got there, they'd lost hope and there was indifference. And that was the real turning point for South African rugby. And you have to give Saru a little bit of credit. They made some decisions, but the decision to bring back Rassie Erasmus and his coaching staff was probably the most important decision they made in that organization in the last decade. And we've seen the results now. With the benefit of hindsight, it looks genius, but it was quite a big call to make. They had to fire another coach. They had to go through that whole process. It was 20 months before a World Cup. There were a lot of factors, but that was the biggest turning point. But before we go on, and we know what happened with the Springboks, we've got to talk about a little bit about the history of South African rugby, and Springbok rugby specifically, because while they're the most loved team now, that hasn't always been the case. Springboks started playing Test rugby in 1891. Dobbo was a small boy at that stage. And for much of the 20th century, the Springboks were one of the most powerful rugby teams in the world. They didn't win their first game, by the way. They took them 6 tests before they won their first test match. That was at the turn of the century. But then through the early part of the 20th century, the Springboks dominated. But, I think one of the most forgotten things now in this lovely glow that we live in was that the Springbok emblem and the Springbok team was still seen as embodiment of the apartheid regime. So no matter what they did, they were admired as rugby players, but it was always entwined politically with South Africa. And we could go on for hours and hours and hours about that. And I mean, the flower bomb test and the tour to New Zealand, the protests that happened there. There was the side of Springbok rugby that we liked to ignore at the time, but the reality was they weren't universally popular, even though they were good. And John, your father was a great historian, and he would have covered all the stuff. Did he tell you anything about this sort of era of South African rugby? I mean, besides the excellence of the teams, the sort of political side of it.
The team was excellent, but unpopular. But rugby wasn't. So if we said the oldest club in my dad, I'm only repeating what my father told me ad nauseum towards sickness, that 1875 was when Hamiltons and Villages were started, but a club called Thistle started in 1876 by Scottish fishermen down in the Grand Parade, which was for then sort of so-called freed slaves or Cape Malays. So it was 1 year after the establishment, and that rugby. When District 6 got flattened in the late 60s and early 70s, there were 16 rugby clubs in District 6, obviously all from the non-racial order. And not one of those clubs, when they got sent out to Lentegeur or to Bishop Lathers or Bonteheuvel, not one of those clubs folded. If I've been playing rugby in District 6 and somebody came and bulldozed my house and my field, I may then think about smoking tick and giving up rugby. Dave thinks I did both. But the point is, rugby survived. It was a thriving thing amongst the colonized, the same as cricket. So that's what that lesson was. Rugby, Thistles still exist. They're playing Division 14A with a Thistle here, founded a year after this thing. So there was a completely parallel university of rugby. So I think you're right, Craig. Our national team was popular and successful, but not in the country. But rugby as itself, amongst the people, especially of this region, was phenomenally, and still is phenomenally popular. So that was his take on it. There was this parallel universe, and that's why he sent me to go and play for a year in Elsie's River as punishment for getting back too late from the pick and whistle. But,
Thanks, Dobbo. And, we could go on for hours and hours, but that was sort of where South African rugby was. And then, of course, we isolation ends, South African Springboks are allowed back into the fold. And one of the most famous images of South African rugby is Nelson Mandela in the replica number 6 shirt, handing the World Cup to Francois Pienaar in 1995. And, briefly that changed the perception of the Springbok. I think what Madiba did, allowed the Springbok to stay on the jersey, which those of us that are old enough to remember in the 90s, it's been an ongoing debate whether the Springbok emblem should be done away with, as it has been in most other sports. But, as we look at the prism of today, thank goodness it was kept. But, those were serious conversations that were happening in the 90s. And Madiba gave it a stay of execution through his gesture at that moment. And, South Africans, I think, throughout this post-isolation period, the last 30 years of Test rugby that we've played, have come to support the Springboks. I think even when, if you think of the 2007 World Cup or the 99 World Cup, people stopped and watched the Springboks. And I say people, I mean all South Africans. But I don't think there was a true love across the board, even through the 90s and the early 2000s for the Springboks. They were the national team and people accepted that. But there wasn't a true. I work at Daily Maverick with lots of former anti-apartheid activists, and it's only in the last 6 years where my colleagues have said to me, this team is our team. And we'll get to those. So it has changed, and that's great. And this is where we are now. But we've had to come through this hard road. It has been a rocky road. And I think what changed is the appointment of Siya Kolisi as captain. That really gave a new image to the Springboks. And not only is he a great player and a great guy, he looks like 80% of South Africa. And that's what people resonate with. And, as it's turned out, it's fortunate that he's been as great as he is as a person, because he's really and truly changed the face of the game. And Rassie Erasmus has a lot, I think he's got to take a lot of credit for that. It was a bold move at the time in 2018. Dave, Dobbo, you both worked with Siya as a youngster. Maybe Dave, did you, or Dobbo, did you see in his early days, did you see him as being a Springbok captain of this caliber?
I'd imagine 19 and a 21, and definitely not. So it probably goes to your point of giving Rassie credit. So he was a great guy, always talented, definitely. But him and Scarrow were thirsty and out and about. And no. I mean, the truth is, I never saw him as the caliber of your nation builder. That's really a good guy. Really, I mean, we actually discussing whether he comes back to us now, and it's more about the quality of the human being than anything else. But no, Dave knows more. But he was just a great team guy. The one thing about the problem with Siya, I'll shut up for a while after this. The debate about Siya now actually coming back to the Stormers is he comes back, and Dave will know as well because he works with them, that he's such a good team guy. He'll put everything to every game. You can see how well he's playing for the Sharks and that sort of thing. But our worry is actually his stratification of how big he is. Because we went on a Stormers before he left us the last time. The Springboks just won the World Cup in 2019, and Bongi Benambi got off the team bus at the Ultra City or something on the way to the wilderness, and people say there's Bongi and selfies and photos. I wish people just sign paper, but it's for selfies. And then Peter Steff, who'd been player of the tournament or player of the match, I can't remember, gets off, and the people start mobbing him. When Siya gets off the bus, the people literally putting the petrol stop, drop it. The ladies in the shop start ululating. It's I don't know how he survives. And that's the problem, is the challenge that, for the team, brilliant, but he's just so big now. But no, I didn't see it as I could claim that I saw it. I dropped him for the game against the Sharks away. So.
Well, I mean, and that brings us to the nadir. There was 57-0 in Albany on the 16th of September, 2017. That was a doubly bleak day for me because that's my birthday as well. So that was a good way to start the day. But that was where South African rugby had to get to, and that was the ultimate result that led to the appointment of Rassie Erasmus and what followed. And Saru's leadership needed to improve technically and tactically. But also, I think we got to say Rassie Erasmus came back with certain conditions, and one of them was to be able to select overseas-based players, which wasn't a luxury that Alistair Coetzee had, to be fair to him. And that was one of the conditions he took the job on, and that has proven to be an essential ingredient into the Springbok success because of what's, the fact that so many players are based in Japan or Ireland or France. They're getting paid in euros, yen, and pounds, and they're off the SARU books, and they're still available to the Springboks. So it works really well from a Springbok point of view. I'm sure Dobbo maybe won't love it from a South African provincial rugby point of view. I mean, but it's certainly a system that works for the Boks.
Dave's better. I mean, actually, the question would be great. How good would we be if we can fund the overseas? Do you know what I mean, Dave? Because we actually the development, aren't we? No.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the nice things about players playing overseas is just the IP that they bring back with them. You know, so you've got players playing in France and England and Japan, and have intel and insights into how those teams play. So when we're preparing against those teams, you know, a lot of those players will take the lead in coming up with a game plan and things like that. But the big thing for South African rugby is the cost of having those players. For Dobbo's better players in the Springbok environment, how it works is we have a dual contract basically between us and the franchise. And so we pay some money to the franchise for the use of those players during test matches. But we obviously can't do that for everybody. And so it's helpful that we are able to select those players from overseas. When you think about those players that are playing overseas, a lot of them are the older, more experienced players. And what it does is it forces Dobbo to pick some of the younger guys and give them very valuable experience playing in Europe in some of our top teams. So there's the added benefit that supply and demand, I guess, forces him to pick some of the players that maybe he wouldn't pick if Asia was around. You know, instead he's forced to pick Johan Roos or one of those type of players who gets exposure where he might not have otherwise.
Thanks, Dave. So, I mean, this is an organizational cohesion graph. And I know SARU takes a lot of flack, and if we're talking about the equity deal at the moment, there's a lot of noise going on about that. But the reality is the governance of SARU appointed Erasmus. It led to a better structure, better cohesion, better coaching, and it echoes outwards. And the results have been there for all to see with the Springboks. So that was the first and most important step. And as ever in high performance sports, you know, the main thing is winning, and the Springboks came up with that mantra, let the main thing be the main thing. But what's important to also remember is that despite changing and looking for a new style of play or a winning style of play, I think the Springboks stayed true to their core values. Eddie Jones said it best years ago when he was working with the Springboks with Jake White in around that 2007 World Cup. He said, I can't do an Eddie voice, but you know, you got to be culturally sympathetic, mate. And what he was saying, you've got to stay true to the culture that's made your rugby powerful. And you know, the Aussies play differently. Dave, you can tell us more about how the Aussies play fundamentally to South Africans, big forwards. We put a premium on defence, but you know, those are game-specific things. Those are technical and tactical issues. But the missing ingredient in Springbok rugby for a long time had been connection. I think the reason they're doing this, other than just winning, and that's what's come and grown out of this team. And that's, you know, they made South Africa the biggest thing, not just winning. Winning is the biggest thing, but it really matters is winning for South Africa. You know, I think they put winning aside from, you know, winning for themselves, winning for their own personal glory, for their families. That was part of it. It's all part of it. But winning for South Africa was the main thing, and that's what they instilled in these guys. And it comes through authenticity. I think if I think of the Springboks in the current iteration, the one word that I always come back to is authenticity. They're unique, this bunch. Everything they do feels real. And I know behind the scenes, and you know, there will be fights in organizations, and Rassie will butt heads with people like Dobbo and Dave. That's normal. But when they're out on the field, when they're representing South Africa, when they talk about playing for people and giving hope, it comes from an authentic place. Dave, Dobbo, maybe you agree or disagree on that point, but that's my own personal take from this team, having worked around them, is everything they do has a purpose, and it's a genuine purpose.
I was lucky enough recently to have lunch with a guy called Benazir, I don't know if you remember who he is. Does anybody remember who Benazir is?
No.
Right. Yeah. Correct. He was the French lock that scored in the 1995 semi-final at Durban. If you remember, it was pelting down with rain. The game should never have happened. And I think nowadays, because of TMO, we would have pulled that replay back, and the try would have been awarded. But in those days, it wasn't awarded because I think the referee Tony Spreadbury also knew that he's not getting out of Durban alive if the try was awarded. And that's what Barley Swart said, the famous thing: you can go up, you can go down, you can go forward, but you can't come backwards. And we kick it out from that resulting scrum, and we end up making the World Cup final. If the game had ended, if the game hadn't taken place because of all the bad weather, we would have been out of the World Cup if it ended in a draw. Because a few weeks earlier at the Battle of Boet Erasmus, if you remember, there was a big fight against Canada. And James Dalton and
Peter Hendricks.
Who?
Peter Hendricks, I think.
Peter Hendricks were red carded. And the rules of the competition said that the team with the most red card, the worst disciplinary record, in the event of a draw, would be excluded from the competition. So it's really important that we played that game. And Benazir said a great thing afterwards, as he said, South Africa needed that more than France. So he said he's never claimed the try publicly, which is a pretty amazing thing. But if you think about that moment, had he scored, we were gone, we were out. It was the end of the game. There'd be no Rainbow Nation, there'd be no Chester Williams, there'd be no Francois Pienaar, there'd be none of that. In the last World Cup, if Cheslin Colby doesn't charge the kick down, the conversion down from the touchline, which is something, I've watched thousands of games of rugby, I've never seen that. If Handré Pollard doesn't kick the winning goal 3 times in playoff games in the last play of the game, there's no double World Cups, there's no Siya Kolisi, none of those things. And so one of the things that Rassie talks about a lot in his messaging to the players is don't be an entitled dick. Don't take for granted the role of luck in your success. The fact that you were born in a privileged family or that you went to a nice school or whatever the case may be. Just accept that at some point there's a huge element of luck in your success and behave like that. And I think that's a huge part of the team, Craig. And little things like knowing the bus driver's name, all those little bits and pieces add up, and they genuinely are like that as a group.
And we'll unpack that a little bit more in a moment. And on this part of authenticity. Oh, sorry, just knocked my microphone off. Can you still hear me? Yeah. Siya and Rassie, a lot of politicians will have you believe, a lot of people on social media will have you believe that South Africa is divided. It's probably more compartmentalized, really, than divided as a country. And we saw that when people support the Springboks, it's not divided at all. And this team has found a way to jump out of those compartments and bring those compartments together. And they've given South Africa common ground to support the Springboks. And they've done it through the, many things, but the 4 C's. These are kind of the way the Springboks base their entire existence, through connection, craftsman, clarity, and commitment. And we can go through each of those in a moment. Connection is what Dave touched on. No entitlement, leave egos at the door, and hold yourselves responsible for those around you. You've shown it, Dave, and it's a team that cares for each other, but it's a team that always puts the collective above the individual. And when it comes to the collective, I mean South Africa as well. I mean, this is to me a great example of connectivity.
A great tackle was from Wilson.
Could have scored, yeah.
McTwimpy putting him behind for back to Zoli.
Oh, we love it. We still get goosebumps every time we watch that try. Yeah. I mean, he could easily have. Sorry, I just got to go back out of this. No, just click there. Sorry.
Good tackle.
We can watch it all day. Watch it on repeat. I suppose we have been for the last 6 years as well. So that's just one small example of that. And being craftsman, that's really becoming brilliant at what you do, what your job is. It wasn't this iteration of the Springboks, but it was Heineke Meyer's iteration of the Springboks that had a good saying as well. They said, know your job, do your job. And, it's a simple instruction, not always so simply carried out. And I think this group has really done that. And Dobber, you work with a lot of the Springboks in the Stormers environment. Do you pick up on that sense, and do they bring that back into the provincial setup a little bit as well? And I'm not saying they don't do that at the Stormers, but they experienced players, and they obviously lead by example when they come back into a slightly lower tier of rugby.
They don't drive. They don't drive those values. I think that's that Springbok environment is so different and so that's so competitive. And how many players did you use last year? 55.
50 in total.
So if one of those players strays vaguely out of line, like you said, Craig, to your point of entitlement, or that guy goes and there's another world class, because we're sitting with a generationally probably the best in all of our lifetimes. The Springboks have never been this much above everybody else in the world. So there's that amount. So when they come to us, it's not that, it's very different. We have to be very nice to them, grateful to have them, because we're their day job. When they go to the Springboks, let's see, Alan, you weren't good enough against England, off you go. There's 5 other world-class players ready to come in. But I must say, credit to them is that they come in incredibly humble. Dave, you know them well. Kitsy, Frans Maherba, Dion Fourie, I'll leave Marnie off the list, but they're incredibly humble and engaging, and they won't ever come and say, "Oh, the Boks, we do this," because I think that's the culture of arrogance that the Springboks breed. But if you sit with Dion and say, "What's your plan?" They'll share everything. So they're just almost too good to be true in the way they come down and engage and contribute. But never ever do they say, "At the Boks, we do this," which they have every right to do, because the Boks in some ways are far superior technically and obviously player quality-wise is superior to us.
I think probably what Dobber was talking about, competition. I think people sometimes forget how hard it is to be a Springbok, because we get so many people coming up to us saying, there's such and such a guy playing at Rondebosch or Bishops, he's the easiest future Springbok. I think since Craig knows the data better than me, but I think Springboks have been going since
1891.
And there's about 900 Springboks in all of that time.
945. Yeah.
John Gardner, who was the headmaster at Bishops, used to say, if you take the youngest guy on the Springbok team, let's say that's, I don't know, Sasha, probably 21, and the oldest guy is probably 35, 36. That's a spread of about 15 years. It's less than 1 year for every guy, for every age group at school. So if all the under 16s playing, thousands of them across the country, less than one of those guys is going to be a Springbok. And that really puts that in perspective. In Dobber's role, we used to have guys come to the building, and he was the best number 8 or the best fly half in Craven League. And he'd come there in his first week, and he'd get humbled pretty quick, because he was a big fish in a small pond. And he suddenly gets there, and he suddenly realizes there's 10 years of the best number 8s in the building. And now he doesn't have to just be the best number 8 of his age group. He has to be the best number 8 of 15 years worth of age groups. That's a totally different kettle of fish. So I think I think harnessing the competition for spots has been one of the key things. He's dropped big names at the right time, almost a bit like Alex Ferguson. Russie's not scared to make brave calls, and I think that's kept a lot of the big players whose egos and things could traditionally run away with him a little bit sharper.
And that leads into the same theme of craftsmen. As good as these guys are, they've got to do the work. They've got to keep working hard, because there's 10 guys snapping at their heels. And you already spoke about it a little bit earlier, but it's still worth watching again. This is the craftsman at work, Cheslin Colby. This wasn't by accident. This was hours and hours of studying.
Upgrade the way you trade with the Exodus mobile app.
The free
Trade with
version.
fast execution.
If you're not jumping,
I'm
you're
too
not
cheap.
French. That's what they say. Ramos. It's been charged down by Cheslin Colby.
In a game of inches and millimeters,
It remains
that was the
12 inches.
difference. Which brings us on to clarity, which is the 4th C. And rugby is a complex game, and there's so many laws and so many techniques and tactics, and it's so little time, especially in the Springbok environment, to work with the players. So how do you get the message across to the players? It comes with simplifying complex issues. And I know that in some cases in the Springboks, they'll distill it down to 4 bullet points for certain players. Dobber, I don't know, how do you work at the Stormers? But I mean, the complexities of rugby don't change between the Stormers and the Springboks. And how do you get that kind of data across to players?
Yeah, it's actually, I don't know if it's the trend, but it's, yeah, we'll try and get it down. There's so much from the GPS now to the mouth guards, which are telling you how many where the guys, how many impacts they've had. So the GPS stuff, I mean, we wouldn't have lost it. They tell you how many decelerations, which I would have been good at. But the data is just, Dave's very good with data. It's unfathomable. But we all melt every story every week down to 3 things. And let's say, and I think I don't know how the Springboks work, but it might be something around the aerial game. It might be something around the gain line. And we'll try and get that down to one theme. I'm using a cliched one, like if you play the Bulls, it might be the rumble in the jungle, where you go there. The big juggernaut is George Foreman, and Ali said, "Are you tired? Are you really, are you tired, George? And how are you going to make them tired? And the speed and rope a dope." But it'll come. We'll literally try and get it down. You won't try and add more than 3 things. I think the most important thing for those players when they go on the field is actually to feel safe. And what I mean by safe is that there's obviously that they're rested, they're trained, but they're well prepared, and there's a nice simple plan. If we try and tell them a million different things, and it's actually a challenge of coaches, because coaches want to be, want to sort of show, I've got this much knowledge and 400 clips, and this is why this guy's going to swivel on his right foot. But I reckon in the heat of what's going on out there, they want it really, really simple. I think, and that's where some of this, I think we're not dissimilar to how they're working at international level.
I think
it'll be simple.
Sorry, Dave.
I mean, I think I think what Robert says, I'll give you an example, is when we kick the ball, put the ball in the air, players have to chase at a certain percentage of their max speed, and it's measured on their GPS. So when the ball is kicked, everybody's accountable for the intensity with which they chase. But I think one of the challenges is that you can fall in love, as Dobber says, with data, and you can stop actually coaching. So one of the things we measure a lot, maybe you've heard about it at the Springboks, we call it battle rates, which is just how many times a player gets into a battle. And a battle is a tackle or a ruck or something that takes physical effort. And the debate we have a lot is that, like, if you take a player like Lionel Messi in soccer, Lionel Messi walks for most of the game. Very low battle rate. Going from Union, very low battle rate. But then he picks his moments, and there's 1 or 2 battles that he has with the game. So we're having this internal debate about falling in love with data and science and all of that, when in actual fact, sometimes better players are just better players and can pick their moments, work less than other players. The analogy we had the other day was that the ball's hit to a field and a fielder dives and makes a great stop. Everybody thinks, geez, he's a wonderful fielder. Actually, the better fielder has anticipated that shot. He's already walked to his right before the shot's even played, and then he just picks the ball up and throws it back to the keeper. Looks a lot less spectacular, but he's a much better player. So I think data has changed rugby a lot over the last sort of 10 to 15 years. Everything is analysed. We've got Dobber will have 6 or 7 cameras on a game. You can pull up software of all of that's coded. You can click on tackles. You can watch individual players. You can get percentages of missed tackles on his left shoulder versus right shoulder. All sorts of things. But in some ways, it has ruined the game a little bit by making us focus on all of those things and maybe not being creative enough or innovative enough in other ways.
I think a story in the early 2000s in the box had Tim Lane, Aussie Rugby League legend, doing their defence, and he came with a Rugby League defence, and the players were so confused, and they were running drills at training, and a back line of 7 players couldn't get past 3 defenders, and eventually the players just went to Rudolph Straley, was the coach, and says, "Oh, coach, just tell me who to tackle," and so sometimes they can get a little bit paralysed by too much data, and it's been whittled down. Commitment, not just commitment on the field. We know that rugby players put their bodies on the line. They put their heads in places that most normal people wouldn't. But I think it's the commitment to do the extra training, the commitment to spend half an hour afterwards kicking a goal. It's that level of commitment that has been instilled in the Springbok, this iteration of the Springboks as well, that has gone to a new level. And you can't underestimate that, and I don't think we'll have to unpack that too much more. I think it's quite self-explanatory. And those are the 4 official C's, but I think there's a few more C's that we could add to that list. Character. When Rassie and Jacques, they had a lunch with a couple of the media after the 2019 World Cup, And over a few drinks, they were just discussing their selection criteria. And I think at that stage, it might have changed, Dave, but they had 13 criteria that they looked for in a player. And yeah, technical ability, his fitness, his elasticity, his explosiveness, all these kind of things. But top of the list was character. It was the kind of guy who was going to get up and make another tackle and another tackle in the 81st minute. And you can't teach that. Peter Steph du Toit, 28 tackles in the Rugby World Cup final. I mean, I think 29 of them were on Geordie Barrett. And to your point, some players choose their moments, but get into 80 battles and win 60 rather than get into 40 battles and win 35. That just really translates to work rate. And then the next C, I would say, is courage. And obviously courage is, we're not talking about the physical courage of making a tackle or running into a wall of All Black defenders. That goes without saying at that level. And I sort of jotted it down here, but in this iteration, it was the courage to make Siya Kolisi captain, first of all. That took courage. It's the courage to put 7 forwards on the bench, or the courage to make a substitution after 31 minutes in a rugby game. Who's ever done that prior to this lot? It's the courage to apologize to the referees when you know that you've been humiliating them publicly and coming to that realization, however long it took. It's the courage to learn and evolve while having a clear plan and vision. It's the courage to be different, but also to embrace differences. The Springbok side, they encourage people to sing their songs in Afrikaans and Xhosa and English. They encourage the players to be themselves. He encourages the players to go out on their night off and get out of the hotel. It's not, they are treated like adults. And it's the courage to be unpopular, the courage to fight for a lost cause. As Jacques Nienaber famously said after the World Cup final, when Peter Steph was making all those tackles, he said, we chase lost causes. And that's what Cheslin Colby did there. That's what that tackle Kurtley Arendse made in the final, in the corner. It's that courage. And it's the courage to stay in for the long haul. You lose a few battles along the way, but it's the courage to win the war. That's what I mean by courage. That's one of the other big traits that I've found with the Springbok side. And that comes with innovation and the courage to innovate. Playing the French national anthem loudly at training. You can't see it too well there. Taking a mark, taking a scrum from a mark, or the bomb squad. That innovation is, and it doesn't stop there. 4 scrum halves in a match day 23 in the World Cup. I mean, that sent the world, it was ridiculous. Like taking Schalk Brits as a hooker, a third hooker to the World Cup at the age of 37. That's innovation. The Boks were labeled boring in 2019 when they launched high bombs and they created a chain of players. Everyone did it. It's now been outlawed. Same as the scrum from the mark. So that level of innovation, and there's so many other tactics, that they're not scared to try at the highest level. And that comes with risk. But to be innovative, you've got to have courage, and you've got to take some risks. Dobbo, I mean, there's some of the stuff they're doing that 8 years ago people wouldn't have thought of doing in rugby. I mean, Rassie in particular has changed the face of the game in that sense, hasn't he?
Yeah, I think, Dave and I we worked with him for years. He's the most innovative guy. That mind never stops. But it is like, he phoned or WhatsApped me before the World Cup because Dion Fourie was playing. I think he meant Dion Fourie rather than Scott Craig, but Dion was playing with us and he was.
He meant in 2019, sorry.
So Dion, this one was 30. He lies by a year, so he's 38 now. And Rassie actually said to me, can you play hooker still? Because he played hooker for the Stormers, I think, in the 2015 around that sort of era. And I said, we wouldn't even put him on the bench for the Stormers. And we said to him, once we were thin, and we watched him throw him. He said, no, for the Stormers, he wasn't even a number 3, impossible. So he said, well, I'm going to take him ahead of, who was the guy who left controversially when Malcolm got injured?
Dweber.
Dweber, yeah.
Yeah.
And he said, and I said, you're mad. What happens if Bongi goes down in the second minute of the World Cup final? This guy will never, ever survive. I don't know. He wouldn't listen to my advice, but he was just making an inquiry. And exactly what happened. And Fionfree ends up captaining the team and hosting the World Cup. I mean, the substitution of not taking Hooker and then taking Pollard, and it's remarkable. I mean, you're right, Craig. It's courage. I mean, you watch the bench. We sit, as Dave and I will sit in a coach's box, and you keep one forward, one person back into the 70s because you don't want to finish the game with 14. So you could theoretically, not that we were cheated around a HIA or a front row, you can manipulate that a little bit. But if a back does a knee and you both your backs, so if you've got a 6 tool, there's no hiding that. You can't then suddenly hold your head and the guy's legs off. So then you don't. But so you don't empty your bench. I think that's the convention, Craig, until 70 minutes. The Springboks can be empty in the late 40s.
Yeah,
it's just a staggering risk, but they're brave, and it works. It hasn't. I don't know. It hasn't backfired.
Well, as Dave said, luck plays a part, I suppose, and that was where we started. But it's you make your luck, as Gary Player, I think, famously said. And to do all of this, they've got to have plans. I mean, that is the reality. There's got to be plans and elite player development, correct fitness for the game model, and succession planning. And Dave, maybe you can talk to the elite player development. That program's been running for a while, but that's important, and that I suppose ties into the succession planning. It's all in place now. And even the correct fitness model for the game. And we don't play like Japan. So Springbok rugby players have to be conditioned in a different way to Japan or Japanese rugby players or some other country. So maybe you can just elaborate a little bit on these.
He developed the elite player development system, the EBD system, before I arrived at SA Rugby. So he takes the credit for it. It starts basically at under 16 level. So it's our first EPD camp. And what happens is we have a lot of scouts around the country that basically try to identify the top sort of about 100 under 16 players, and we bring them all to camp for a week or two, and we test them across various things, and then that's repeated every year as they go through school. Sometimes the groups change, sometimes not. And I think of in the last Springbok group, only one player who was debuted out of the extraordinary number of players that debuted last season didn't come through our EPD program. So it shows the success of that program. But we're also very lucky now because almost every schoolboy game in the country is filmed by SuperSport schools. So we have a big database of any player you want to watch, any stats you want to get. You can click on a bit of software and you can start watching the hooker from Stellenberg or wherever and comparing this hooker to that hooker. And so we have a little department of guys now at SA Rugby. They're called the Talent Management Department, which is headed by Louis Kuhn. That's full-time job is to do that, is to look for the next group of players. It's very easy to find the players who went to Paul Ruiz and that sort of thing. They've only got 3 sports at Paul Ruiz. You can play rugby, you can be the medic for rugby, or you can leave the school. So it's very easy to find those, but it's much more difficult to find the players who come out of smaller schools. And it's one of the nice things about the current Springbok Group 2 is that the vast majority of them didn't go to rugby recognised schools that you would know. They all went to kind of little town schools and things like that, and were identified through the EPD program. So it's one of the things we're proud of. It's succession planning, really. We put a lot of effort into it.
I think the last real trait of the Springbok side, at least from my perspective, I'm sure there's a lot more, honesty, transparency, and accountability. I mean, I guess that goes in most businesses, most teams, but the honesty is that plans are communicated well in advance. So most players in this setup know that they're going to, all things being equal, and they fit. I'm going to play against Portugal and I'm going to play against Australia away. I'm not going to play against the All Blacks. That's communicated well in advance, and that takes away anxiety in the team setup, especially at test level. So that honesty and transparency. Team meetings, selection meetings are open. Players can go and sit in and ask questions. That's open. There's an open door policy in the Springboks as it stands now. Rassie is the final word, don't get me wrong. But you can go in and ask questions. And then there's accountability. I mean, and then that, again, I suppose goes without saying, but it's an easy thing to say, accountability. It's not always so easy to achieve. And players are not only accountable to the coach, they're accountable to each other. And that player-driven accountability is massively important in the success of the Springbok team. So where does that leave us? Well, we started in 2017, indifference and no hope. And I think the Springboks have spoken about it. They can't fix South Africa's problems, but they're one thing that is the best in the world. And they show South Africans what excellence really looks like. They're not going to fix the lights at Escot or the potholes in Johannesburg or the water, but they give us a measurement to follow. And, you know, I think my colleague wrote this. Their resilience lifts us. It tells us that, yes, we are broken and have suffered in many ways, but we are not beyond repair. By tapping into our strengths, our people, our stories, our will, we can create something extraordinary. And that's what this group of Springboks has done for us. So what's the lesson, I suppose? Winning is important, obviously. The team is important. Individuals are important. Tactics, image, all of those things are important. But without purpose and without authenticity, all those things aren't enough. The Springbok side has elevated themselves to a level above. And long may it continue, Dave. Yeah, end of the lesson. Any questions we can take? We've got microphones.
Yeah, Dobbo will have a different view on this maybe than I do. I think that's one of the big risks in South African rugby. But I was also in Australia where we played in Super Rugby. Super Rugby was a sprint. You played 3 or 4 months a year. You only had 7 home games. Like I used to say to people, if you ran a restaurant, you said we're only going to be open for 7 nights of the year. Everyone can see the business model. That's not going to work. And it was a little bit the same in Super Rugby. We just couldn't financially make that viable. So there's a need to play more games to support the salaries and things of the players. But what happens when you play, I think at the Stormers, when I was there, we played, I think, 40 games or something 2 seasons ago. That's a lot of rugby. And in order to play that many games, your attrition rate of the players are getting, there's more and more injuries. So you need a bigger squad. One of the challenges of that then is that where, say, for example, the Springbok Sevens teams, you know, the squads in Super Rugby, I don't know what they were in South Africa, maybe 35, 38 players. They're now contracting close to 50. So where the Springbok Sevens team used to benefit from players, you know, 39 to 50, we don't get those players anymore playing Springbok Sevens because they're now sitting in the back end of professional teams. And your challenge is if you don't get the injuries, you get very, very good players who never get a chance. And their career can actually quite easily pass them by because a guy ahead of them didn't get injured, but they needed to be there in case he did, you know. So there's a real risk for the next generation of players in South Africa that you're getting a lot of good players going to help hold tackle bags at franchises. I know Dobbo wrestles with that a lot. How do we get them games so that they can get better without compromising your season or compromising performance? I don't know if I've...
Oh, but maybe you want to give him a provincial.
Dave's right. The challenge is the guys are not playing. That's what breaks you because all these guys playing rugby want to play the sport. They're warriors. They're martial people. It's not a sport you chose. You don't tick bank clerk or rugby player. It's something that's in them. So they're not playing. But, you know, we've said, I was moaning to Craig and Dave as we started, at every press conference at the start of the season, people said, how are you going to fit Sasha, Feinberg, Amazulu, Damian Willemse, Warwick Gelant, Mani Lebok, Ruan Nel, Dan du Plessis, Sibylla Sinatla, and Rory Gelant into one backline? The truth is only one of them's fit. The others are out for months. They're just not playing. It's such a brutal sport now. And I think, you know, those collisions, I mean, it's unfathomable to come up the rugby that we grew up in now, because then there were fat round people that you could avoid, and thin small people, the consequence of hitting were not so bad. And now it is, you watch the training, you know, I was holding a bag for Zas, he's a small, he's a bag like this, and he's on his stomach there. Zas hit the shield. I landed on my head, and it was a wing from on a tackle bag. So it's a hell of a, we budgeting for a catastrophic injury for every player every 3 months, and that's 3 months. Catastrophic being defined as being out for 3 months. So we sit here at the Stormers, and literally without, I mean, if we looked at our roster, you'd say, gee, but you've got Sasha Marnie and Damien Willemse can play for, all injured for, they were out for months and months. So I don't know what to, so the solution is what, you contract more, because they've said, and then those guys then get redundant. So the wrestling, I think, is a challenge. There are good rules from Sorry about rest. We have to give them 8 weeks, but 3 + 3 + 2. But what is a challenge now is that unbalanced, and Dave will know more than me, playing on Boxing Day when we should be at Stillby or whatever the story is. This non-global season, I think that is really stretching it, because a guy who's very periphery of the Springbok squad, if he's not going to Pleasant Place rugby championship, then will get thrown back into the Stormers, and he can end up at almost never. You know more about that than me, but it's not nice seeing what's going on at the moment with just the attrition rates. I mean, just today, I literally on the way here, 3 players, not of the 3 I've mentioned, out for 6 months based on scans from Saturday's game. 6 months. It's crazy.
Question up there.
Craig, thanks. My question is Rassie and Jacques' legacy. It's kind of 2-part. What happens after Rassie and Jacques? How long do we have them? But not so much that, the success that they've created, do you attribute it completely to them, or did the team and the individual players rise up to meet him? So it's kind of like a 2-part question.
It's a tough one to answer if it can attribute it completely to them, but they lost 57-0, and 13 of those players went on to win the World Cup 2 years later. So the same players who lost 57-0 won a World Cup 2 years later. So I think that's a clear indication that something changed in the coaching and in the setup of the team that worked, and he was able to tap into emotional drivers and into tactics and technical ability. What happens after Rassie? Dave can answer that. He's the director of rugby, and there's a succession plan. But Rassie goes, I mean, Jacques already left. He's at Leinster in Ireland, and he might come back. I don't know. But, he's doing a good job there. And Rassie has got a very clear plan and mandate until 2027, and that's to win World Cup in Australia. And after that, I don't know. I would imagine win or lose, it probably would be the natural end of a cycle, but you can never say never. But Dave, I mean, without giving too much away, I'm sure there's a succession plan in place with the Springboks.
Yeah, I mean, Rassie has said publicly that he's going to leave at the end of 2027. And we're lucky that we do have a lot of really good candidates. Dobbo, Franco Smith, Johan Ackerman, Johan van Graan. There's a lot of good South African coaches doing very well in Europe and other places at the moment. And there's also some very good coaches in the current Springbok setup that might put their hands up, which would make a lot of sense. But I think what the coaches have done really well. It would be very easy for Rassie to try to keep going with the players that he has, and instead he hasn't done that. He's I think almost without noticing, we reinvented a lot of the players in that group, and putting young guys like Sasha and Grappie's, what's Grappie's real name? For Van der Berg, the scrum off from the Lions. There's a lot of young players that can play another 2 or 3 World Cups. I think if we win 3 World Cups in a row, that will never be repeated again. I can't see that being repeated again. But what also deserves some credit, and I can say this because they're my bosses, is that when I worked in Australian rugby, and to that graph that Craig put up just now, is the impact of bad governance on high performance. High performance doesn't exist in a vacuum. If the organisation is poor and the leadership is poor, it's very hard for the team to win on field. And if you look at Australia, they've had brilliant coaches: Dave Rennie, Eddie Jones, Jonah, really good coaches. But because the administration is so poor off the field, they just can't get it right, and they just can't win. Now, keep spending money on the big coaches, but they never fix the root cause of the problem, which is the people that sit at Moore Park at Rugby Australia headquarters. And so one of the things I think Dobbo and I both quite enjoy working for Rian, because I think Rian gives you what you need to do to perform, and then he leaves you alone. And so he takes a lot of slack in the media recently and stuff. I guess that's the role of the CEO at times in a political environment. But he's been really good for on-field performance. He won a URC competition with the Stormers when he was the administrator there with us, and then he's obviously won a World Cup with the SA Rugby. He's moved over there. So,
any other questions?
To what extent does money influence the game? It might seem stupid, but I'm sure money has a huge influence on the quality and the outcome of the game. And to what extent?
Who you want? Well, I mean, England's the richest, and France are the two richest rugby unions in the world, and they didn't win the World Cup. So it certainly it's a factor. There's no doubt about it. I mean, Fiji are never going to win the 15s World Cup because they don't have the money and they can't play in any competitions. So money is a factor from my point of view, but it's not the be all and end all. I mean, South African rugby players haven't really changed over the last 6 years, as we alluded to. Rassie's just managed to tap into what we've got and make it better. And as we spoke about earlier, a lot of our players play overseas, saving South African rugby money. Someone else is paying them largely, or a high percentage of their income, and they represent the Springboks. So, I think I always compare, and maybe you can disagree with me, I always compare South African rugby a bit to Brazilian or Argentinian soccer. We're an export market. Brazilian and Argentinian footballers make the good ones ply their trade in Europe. They play in European clubs. South African rugby players, the good ones and the experienced ones, go and play in Japan and France and England and make more money there. It's simple economics. The rand is weak. So while we don't have money, we found a way, and Argentina did it in football. They won the World Cup as well. We found a way to make the lack of money still work for us, but still tapping into our brilliance. Dave, maybe you've got more insight on
I mean, I think the rugby equity deal and all this sort of stuff. South African rugby, I think, is in better financial state. The only rugby union in the world that's in better financial state than us is Argentina. And the reason is for exactly what Craig said. None of the Argentina players play in Argentina. So Argentina gets all the money out of the rugby championships and all these test matches, but they don't have to pay their player base for most of the year because those players are playing in France or in Europe. About 80% of SA Rugby's revenues come from the Springboks, and we got in trouble financially because of COVID and because of the World Cup. So one of the reasons rugby is in financial trouble is because in the World Cup, all of the money goes to World Rugby. So we actually make a loss in the year that we win a World Cup, which is just crazy. We can't put our branding on the front of jerseys. We can't look after our commercial partners. We can't do all of those things. So on the back of COVID and the World Cup win, and because we then have to pay the players and the coaches all their bonuses and things like that, we end up making this big loss. And that's why South African rugby, I think, is where it is from a cash flow perspective, probably. But then we're actually not in a bad financial state, certainly compared to the rest of rugby around the world. And I kind of forgot what the rest of the question was.
No, well, it was about money, really. I think we got a time for one more question over there.
You mentioned the benefit of having some of the Springboks playing overseas. How do you keep them in the loop and communicate with them so that they are up to speed all the time with South African needs?
So how they select, I reckon there's probably 3 or 4 basic steps in winning in high performance sport. The first step is you must get the best players. You can be the best coach in the world. If you don't have the best players, you're not going to win. So the Springbok staff spend a lot of time getting the best players. They have probably about 100 players on a watch list, and they watch every game, every action of those players, and they meet every week, even when they're out of camp, to go through the squad and move the names around, compare this guy with that guy in real detail. So by the time the camp comes, they've spent hours and hours and hours going through those lists. They also know all the things about permutations. If you're going to play my man Grappies, who's a young 9, and you're going to play him with Sasha, that means you've got a young 9-10. They wouldn't necessarily do something like that. They would pair the young 9 with an older 10. So they've thought through all of those little bits of detail. That's the first thing. You must get the best players. The second thing is you must get them fit. So as Craig said, if you want to play like Japan, you want to run the ball and keep the ball alive and do all of that thing, that's a different type of conditioning than the way the Springboks play, which is we're going to grind you, we're going to squeeze you, maul you, scrum you, get you in physical battles. It's a different type of conditioning. And the only reason I mention that is that also has to be really deeply thought through, because you have to plan for that. Players don't get fit in 5 minutes. So it's not the old guy standing there with a clipboard anymore. We've gone to real detail to see who are the players that can repeat those actions over long periods of time that are needed for the way the game is played. And then the third piece of performance, so you get the best players, you get them fit. Once they're fit, you can train with real intensity. And that's what Dobbo's talking about. I think when you go and watch a Springbok training session, people are amazed about how intense it is. The boys, the speed of it, the physicality of it, all of that is just another level. And it, in some ways, must be harder than the game. And you can't do those things not in that order. And that's exactly what Craig was saying when Rassie came in and he said, you know, in our first year, we're going to lose 50% of the game, because he was getting the recruitment piece right. Then he goes and gets Aled Walters in the first World Cup, who was with him at Munster as the head of athletic performance, who's an Irish guy. He didn't trust any of the local guys because he said we weren't up to speed. He wanted someone with international experience. When Aled left, he got another guy, Andy Edwards, who was at Saracens, also a guy with international, with PhD, international experience, all of that, to come in and run his conditioning. So he made sure that those two layers are really better than they've ever been. And then on top of that, he adds excellent coaching and intensity of training and all those bits and pieces, and that creates the outcome. But it's quite easy to get distracted from those few basic steps, particularly when the teams come under pressure. And they're very disciplined about doing those things really deeply and really thoroughly. And I think that's made, what's made all the difference.
Thanks, Dave. And well, thanks to you and Dobbo for joining us this afternoon. Thanks for the insights. Really, really good. And thank you, everyone, for coming out. Yeah, there's some snacks and drinks after. Thanks to the Chris Berger Petra Jackson Fund for coming out as well. And enjoy it. Thank you.